mean I'll see it.
People who don't go caving always ask the same thing. They want to know why anyone would willingly crawl into a hole in the ground just to see how tight they can squeeze their ribs before they snap. I used to have a good answer about the silence and the untouched beauty of the world beneath our feet, but after what happened in those woods near the Tennessee border, I don't go into the dark anymore. I don't even like closing my eyes to shower. Mark and I had been trekking into the backcountry of the Appalachians for years. We weren't pros, but we weren't idiots either. We had the right gear, the right maps, and we always told people where we were going. This specific system wasn't on any of the official tourist guides. It was just a jagged slit in the limestone, hidden under a limestone shelf and some heavy overgrowth. We called it the throat. The air inside was thick and smelled like wet pennies and old, rotting vegetables. That should have been my first warning. Usually, caves just smell like damp earth and stone, but this place felt heavy. It felt occupied. We spent the first hour doing some standard belly crawls through some muddy passages before we reached the base of a vertical chimney. It was a narrow, jagged crack that shot up into the ceiling, maybe 40 feet high. Mark is a better climber than I am, so he took the lead. The plan was for him to shimmy up, find a ledge, and then help me up with the packs. I watched his boots disappear into the shadows above, his headlamp casting flickering, distorted shapes against the wet walls. I stayed at the bottom, clicking my own light off for a second to save the battery. The darkness down there isn't just an absence of light. It's a weight. It feels like it's trying to push its way into your ears and your mouth. I heard the scrape of his gear against the rock, the heavy breathing, the grunt of effort as he hauled himself up. After a few minutes, his voice drifted down from the top. It sounded a bit muffled, but it was definitely him. He sounded excited. He told me he'd found a room up there. He said there was something I really needed to see, and he told me to hurry up. The way he said it was a little strange, though. His voice was flat. It had his accent, his pitch, but the rhythm was off, like he was reading the words off a screen instead of just saying them. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured the acoustics of the chimney were just bouncing the sound around in a weird way. I grabbed the wall and started the climb. My fingers were raw by the time I was halfway up. The limestone was sharp, cutting into my palms, and the smell of copper was getting stronger. I thought I was just smelling my own blood from the scrapes on my knuckles. I kept going, pushing my back against one wall and my feet against the other, inching upward. Every time I slowed down, Mark would call out again from the ledge above. He'd say the same thing. "Hey, I found a room. Come look at this." I finally reached the top and swung my leg over a flat shelf of rock. I was panting, my chest heaving, waiting to see Mark's light or hear him crack a joke about how slow I was. But there was nothing. No light. No Mark. I clicked my headlamp onto the highest setting and swept the beam around the space. My heart actually skipped a beat when the light hit the back wall. There was no room. There was no passage. The ledge I was standing on was maybe 4 feet deep, and then it just ended in a solid, blank wall of prehistoric rock. I was standing in a stone coffin. I felt a cold sweat break out across my neck. I called out his name, thinking maybe he'd found a hole I couldn't see. I yelled for Mark as loud as I could, my voice cracking with the first surge of real, primal panic. Then I heard him. But the voice didn't come from the wall in front of me. It came from way, way down below. From the base of the chimney where I had just been standing. Mark sounded confused, terrified. He was asking me why I had climbed up there without telling him. He was asking who I was talking to. I stood frozen on that ledge. My mind was trying to process the physics of it, trying to find a logical explanation for how he could have gotten behind me. But then I looked down at my feet. In the corner of that dead-end ledge, tucked into the crevice where the floor met the wall, there was a pile of clothes. They were old, stained a dark, crusty brown that looked like dried gore. And next to the clothes, there were pieces of something else. It looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer to a mannequin, but when I leaned closer, I realized it was bone. Shards of a human pelvis, a jawbone with the teeth still mostly intact, and hair. Long, matted clumps of human hair that had been wadded together with something sticky and gray. I realized then that the smell of wet pennies wasn't the cave. It was the ledge. It was a larder. As I stared at the remains, I heard the voice again. It was inches away from my ear this time. It didn't come from the air, it felt like it came from the rock itself. It said, "Hey, I found a room. Come look at this." It was Mark's voice. Exactly his voice. But as it spoke, I heard a wet, clicking sound underneath the words, like someone snapping dry twigs inside a bowl of oatmeal. I spun around, my light catching a movement in the shadows of the ceiling just above the ledge. Something was pressed into the cracks of the rock. It didn't have a shape, not really. It looked like a mass of pale, translucent skin that had been stretched too thin over a frame of mismatched limbs. It had no eyes, just deep, weeping pits in a face that looked like it had been molded out of wet clay. It was mimicking the way a human looks, but it didn't understand where the parts were supposed to go. It had too many joints in its arms, and its mouth was just a vertical slit that was shivering, trying to form the shapes of the words it had stolen from Mark. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I just threw myself off the ledge. I don't remember the fall. I just remember the impact of hitting the walls on the way down, the sound of my own shoulder popping out of the socket, and the blinding white pain that followed. I hit the mud at the bottom hard enough to knock the wind out of my lungs. Mark was there in a second, grabbing my vest, screaming at me, asking what happened. I couldn't speak. I just grabbed his collar with my good hand and pointed up. He looked up, and for 1 second, our headlamps hit the ledge together. The thing was leaning over the edge. It was looking down at us. It didn't have a face, but it was watching. And then, in a perfect, chilling imitation of my own voice, the voice I use when I'm talking to my mom on the phone, it said, "Mark, help me. My leg is broken. Come up here." We ran. We didn't care about the gear. We didn't care about the scrapes or the bruises. We crawled through those narrow passages until our fingernails were torn off and our knees were shredded to the bone. We didn't stop until we saw the moonlight hitting the trees outside the entrance. We never went back for the packs. We told the police we'd been jumped by some hikers, or maybe a squatter living in the woods, because how do you tell a cop that the cave itself tried to eat you using your friend's voice? The worst part isn't the memory of the thing, though. It's what happened a few weeks later. I was staying at Mark's place because I couldn't bear to be alone in the dark. I was in the kitchen, and I heard Mark call me from the basement. He told me he'd found a leak in the pipes and needed me to come down and hold a light for him. I walked to the top of the basement stairs, and I was about to go down. But then the front door opened. Mark walked in from the grocery store, carrying a bag of bread and some milk. He looked at me, confused. And from the darkness at the bottom of the stairs, his voice called out again. "Hey, I found a room. Come look at this. I don't go into the dark anymore. And I never, ever answer when someone calls my name."
Next story.
You know that feeling when you're in a space so tight you can't actually turn your head? Most people get a bit of an itch just thinking about it, but for me, caving was always the one place where the rest of the world finally shut up. There's something about being under hundreds of feet of solid Kentucky limestone that makes your personal problems feel small. But what happened a few months ago, it changed how I look at the dark. It changed how I feel about being alone. I'm telling you this because I need to get it out, and because you're the only one who won't try to put me in a psych ward for it. We were hitting a wild system near the border. It wasn't a tourist spot with handrails and LED lights. This was raw earth. It was me and my buddy, Elias. We'd been through dozens of these systems before. We had the gear, the experience, and the nerve. Or so I thought. We reached a section the locals call the throat. It's a long, horizontal fissure that's barely 14 inches high in some spots. To get through, you have to exhale, slide forward a few inches, and then wait for your chest to expand again. It's a rhythmic, slow-motion crawl that tests every bit of your internal calm. Elias went in first. I watched his boots disappear into the darkness, the red dust from the cave floor kicking up in the beam of my headlamp. After a minute, he called back that he was through the first constriction. I followed. The rock was cold and damp, pressing against my shoulder blades and my chest at the same time. It's a heavy, indifferent kind of cold. About halfway through, the passage dipped. I was flat on my stomach, my chin scraping the grit, arms stretched out in front of me like a diver. That's when I felt it. It wasn't a snag on my harness or a rock shifting. It was a weight. A solid, heavy pressure right in the small of my back. It felt exactly like a large, warm palm pressing down, forcing me into the dirt. I actually grunted as the air was pushed out of my lungs. I figured Elias was being an idiot. He's always been the type to joke around, even when we're in dangerous spots. I figured he'd looped back through a side chimney or something and was trying to freak me out. I yelled at him to knock it off. My voice sounded flat and muffled in that tiny space, deadened by the rock. I told him I couldn't breathe and to get his hands off me. The pressure didn't stop. It actually got harder. The hand shifted, and I could feel individual fingers splaying out across my lower spine. It felt human, but the grip was incredibly strong, almost mechanical. I started to panic, kicking my boots against the floor, trying to worm my way forward into the wider chamber ahead. I finally felt the ceiling lift away from my back, and I scrambled out into a small, bell-shaped room, gasping for air. I spun around, my headlamp cutting a frantic arc through the dark, fully expecting to see Elias laughing at me. But the passage behind me was empty. Just a black, jagged hole in the wall. I called out for him, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. About 5 seconds later, I heard his voice. It wasn't coming from the crawl space. It was coming from a completely different tunnel, maybe 50 feet ahead of me and around a limestone curtain. He asked me what I was screaming about. When he finally walked into the light of my lamp, he was covered in dry dust, not the wet mud from the squeeze. He'd been exploring a lead in the upper gallery the whole time. He hadn't been anywhere near that crawl since he'd passed through it 5 minutes earlier. I tried to explain it to him, but the look on his face told me he thought I was just having a claustrophobic episode. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the skin on my back was tingling. It felt hot. We decided to keep moving toward the exit, but the atmosphere had shifted. The cave didn't feel like a playground anymore. It felt like a mouth. We took a shortcut through a section that wasn't on our primary map, a series of interconnected chambers that smelled off. It wasn't the usual earthy scent of a cave. It was sweet and heavy, like rotting meat mixed with old copper. I should have turned back then. That's the true crime of it. I knew something was wrong, and I kept going. We found the first nest in a small alcove. That's the only word for it. It was a pile of discarded things. Ripped nylon from a backpack, a single hiking boot that looked like it had been chewed on, and several rusted cans of food that had been pried open with something much sharper than a can opener. But it was the bones that made my stomach turn. They weren't animal bones. I saw a mandible, a human lower jaw, sitting on a ledge like a trophy. It still had a few molars attached. Elias saw it too. He didn't joke this time. He just whispered that we needed to leave right now. We turned to head back the way we came, but the light from our lamps caught something in the shadows near the ceiling. There was a ledge, high up, and tucked into the crevice was a figure. It wasn't a ghost. It was too physical for that. It was a man, or at least it had been once. He was terrifyingly thin, his skin a translucent, sickly gray like a blind cave fish. He was completely naked, and his limbs were elongated, his joints knobby and distorted from years of moving through tight spaces. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking at the ground where we had just been standing. And then he dropped. He didn't fall. He flowed down the rock wall with a speed that didn't seem possible for a human. He hit the floor with a wet, heavy thud. Before we could even scream, he lunged at Elias. It wasn't a fight, it was a slaughter. This person, moved with a feral, twitching hunger. He grabbed Elias by the throat, and I heard the sickening snap of cartilage. I watched, paralyzed, as the man's long, jagged fingernails tore into Elias's neck. The blood didn't just spray, it geysered. It looked black in the dim light of my failing headlamp. Elias tried to gurgle something, but his mouth was just filling with red foam. The thing looked up at me then. Its eyes were huge, milky cataracts with no pupils, darting back and forth. It started to make this wet, clicking sound in the back of its throat, and it began to pull Elias's body back toward the nest. It was dragging him by the hair, and I could see the way Elias's heels were bouncing off the rocks. I ran. I didn't think about being a good friend. I didn't think about the gear. I just ran. I squeezed through gaps I didn't think I could fit through, skinning the skin off my elbows and knees until I was leaving a trail of my own blood on the limestone. I could hear him behind me. Not footsteps, the sound of skin sliding on rock. A wet, slithering sound that was getting closer every time I paused to catch my breath. I reached the final squeeze, the one that leads to the surface. I threw myself into it, my heart screaming. Halfway through, I felt a hand grab my ankle. The grip was ice cold this time, and the fingers dug deep into my muscle, tearing through my jumpsuit and into my calf. I kicked with everything I had, feeling my boot connect with something soft and wet. There was a low, guttural hiss, and the grip loosened just enough for me to lurch forward. I burst out of the cave entrance into the night air, falling onto the forest floor. I didn't stop. I ran all the way to the truck, my lungs burning, the taste of copper still thick in my mouth. I drove to the nearest town and found a sheriff. I told them everything. I told them Elias was still down there. They sent a search and rescue team the next morning. They found the nest. They found the scraps of clothing and the old cans. They even found the human jawbone. But they didn't find Elias. And they didn't find the man. They told me the cave system went back for miles, deeper than any map showed, into a labyrinth of unstable passages they couldn't safely enter. They labeled Elias as a presumed death due to structural collapse. But I know what I felt. I still have the scars on my calf, for deep, jagged indentations that the doctors said looked like they were made by a predator. Sometimes at night, when it's really quiet, I can still feel that warm, heavy palm pressing into the small of my back, pushing me down into the dark. It wasn't trying to scare me. It was choosing me.
Next story.
I don't usually talk about why I stopped going out after dark, or why I can't stand being in a basement anymore, even with the lights on. It's one of those things you keep locked away because telling it makes it feel more real, and I've spent the last 3 years trying to convince myself it was just some collective hallucination. But I know it wasn't. My friends know it wasn't. We don't talk to each other much these days, but when we do, I can see the same look in their eyes. We're all just waiting for the sound of something wet hitting the floor. It was back during one of those summers where the heat just hangs over the town like a heavy, wet wool blanket. The air was so thick you could practically taste the dust and the exhaust. We were bored, the kind of bored that makes you do things that seem like a great idea at the time but keep you up at night years later. There's this massive drainage system that runs under the north side of town, near the old industrial park where the chemical plant used to be. Everyone knew about the main vein, which was just this huge concrete tunnel that stayed bone dry from June to August. There were 4 of us. Me, Mark, Sarah, and Chris. Chris was the one who always had the newest gear, the best flashlights, and the most confidence. He'd read about people spelunking in urban drains and convinced us it was the ultimate way to beat the heat. "It's cool down there," he'd say. "It's like a whole different world." He wasn't wrong about that part, it just wasn't a world meant for us. We climbed down the embankment behind the park, sliding through the tall, yellow grass until we reached the mouth of the tunnel. It was a massive concrete circle, stained with years of graffiti and rusted iron bars that had long since been bent open. Stepping inside felt like walking into a refrigerator. The temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly, and the silence, it was immediate. The sounds of the cicadas and the distant highway just vanished, replaced by the sound of our own breathing and the soft crunch of dried mud under our boots. We walked for what felt like miles, deeper into the dark. Chris was leading the way, his heavy-duty flashlight cutting through the gloom like a blade. The walls were covered in a thin layer of fine, gray dust, and occasionally we'd see the skeletal remains of a bird or a rat that had been washed down during a flash flood. We were joking at first, laughing about how we were the kings of the underground. But as the tunnels started to narrow, the mood shifted. The air grew heavier, smelling less like dry earth and more like something metallic. Like copper and old, stagnant water. We reached a junction where the main tunnel split into 3 smaller pipes. Chris wanted to keep going. He pointed to the smallest one on the right, a concrete pipe about 4 feet high. It looked like it hadn't seen water in decades. He told us he'd heard there was an old maintenance room further back that wasn't on any of the city maps. We should have turned around then. I remember feeling this weird pressure in my ears, like the earth above us was pushing down, trying to squeeze us out. But we didn't want to look like cowards, so we followed him, ducking our heads and shuffling into the dark. The further we went, the more the silence changed. It wasn't just quiet anymore, it felt heavy, like the darkness was wrapping itself around us. That's when Chris's flashlight started to act up. It didn't just die, it flickered. It was a rhythmic, strobe-like pulsing that made the shadows jump and dance against the curved walls. Chris cursed, tapping the side of the casing, but the flickering only got worse. In one of those split-second flashes of white light, I saw it. Chris had stopped moving. He was frozen, his light pointed toward a smaller side pipe that branched off to the left, barely 2 feet wide. I was right behind him, looking over his shoulder. In the next strobe of light, a face was staring back at us from the darkness of that side pipe. It was less than 3 feet away from Chris's head. My heart didn't just race, it felt like it stopped entirely. It wasn't a person. I mean, it had the features of a person, but everything was distorted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. The skin was the color of wet parchment, almost translucent, stretched so tight over the skull that you could see the dark lines of veins underneath. It had no hair, no ears that I could see, just 2 massive, wide-open eyes that were entirely too large for its face. They didn't have pupils, just a milky, clouded surface that seemed to catch the dying light of the flashlight. It wasn't hiding. It was just there. It was crouched in that tiny pipe, its body folded in ways that no human skeleton should allow. Its mouth was slightly open, showing rows of small, needle-thin teeth, and a thick, dark fluid was dripping from its chin onto the concrete. The smell hit me then, a wave of rotten old. Blood, so strong I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The only sound was the clicking of Chris's broken flashlight. Then, the thing moved. It didn't scream or growl. It just shifted its weight, and the sound it made was visceral, a wet, tearing noise, like skin peeling off a humid surface. "Run," Chris whispered, his voice cracking. "Run." He didn't have to tell us twice. We scrambled backward, tripping over each other in the narrow space. I remember the sound of my own fingernails scraping against the concrete as I tried to turn around. We were frantic, blinded by the darkness every time the flashlight flickered out. Behind us, from that side pipe, came a sound that I still hear every time I close my eyes. Slap. 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 It was the sound of bare, wet flesh hitting the stone. And it was moving fast. We burst out of the small pipe back into the junction, but we didn't stop. We ran toward the entrance, our heavy boots echoing like gunshots against the walls. But under the sound of our boots, that wet slapping was getting closer. It was rhythmic, steady, and terrifyingly fast. Whatever was following us wasn't running like a person. It sounded like it was moving on all fours, its limbs clicking and snapping as it navigated the tunnel. Sarah tripped. She went down hard, her knees hitting the concrete with a sickening thud. I turned back to grab her, and in the beam of Chris's light, I saw it emerge from the junction. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its long, spindly limbs twitching as it pulled itself forward. Its skin seemed to ripple and sag, and as it moved, it left a trail of that dark, viscous fluid on the floor. I hauled Sarah up, her leggings torn and her knees bleeding, and we just kept going. I didn't look back again, but I could hear it. It was breathing now, a wet, rattling sound, like someone trying to inhale through a throat full of liquid. It was right behind us. I could feel the cold air moving as it reached out. We hit the mouth of the tunnel and didn't even slow down. We scrambled up the embankment, our hands tearing at the dry grass, and we didn't stop until we reached Chris's car. We piled in, the doors slamming shut, and Chris peeled out of that park like his life depended on it. Because it did. We all knew it. We sat in the car for a long time in the parking lot of a well-lit gas station, nobody saying a word. We were all covered in gray dust and Sarah's blood, but there was something else. On the back of Chris's jacket, there was a smear of that dark, foul-smelling fluid. It looked like a handprint, but the fingers were far too long, and there were 5 distinct puncture marks where the fabric had been shredded. We never went back. We didn't tell the police because, what would we even say? That something that looked like a peeled human was living in the storm drains? They would have searched it during the day, found nothing, and we'd be the local freaks. But here's the thing that lingers. A few weeks later, I was sitting in my living room late at night. The house was quiet. And then, from the floor vent in the corner of the room, I heard it. A soft, wet, rhythmic slapping coming from deep inside the ductwork. It wasn't just in the drains. The whole city is connected. The pipes, the sewers, the vents, they're all just veins for whatever is living down there. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I can hear that wet, rattling breath coming from the other side of the wall. It's still down there. And I think it remembers the way we smell. I don't go near the drains anymore. I don't even like to look at the grates in the street when it rains. Because I know that just a few feet beneath the soles of my shoes, something pale and wide-eyed is waiting in the dark, folded into a space where nothing should be able to fit, listening for the sound of someone walking alone.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.